Hi, Dr. H here with Family Centered Parenting. Good to see you all again. Today I want to do some follow up because there's been a good response, kind of healthy response to the videos I've done on ADHD. So I decided today to go into a little bit more depth about ADHD because it seems to be a considerable concern among many parents. So, first of all, let me just again say there's a lot of misinformation about ADHD out there. And I want to at least get rid of some of the misconceptions and really get into the heart of ADHD and what the proper criteria are for ADHD. Because one of the things I've said at workshops when I've done for parents on ADHD, I said, how many people here believe that ADHD is overdiagnosed? And there's a considerable array of hands, and I said, you're right. The next question is, I say, is how many people out there think ADHD is underdiagnosed? And not as many raised their hands, and I said, that's also true. Both are true. It's been both overdiagnosed and underdiagnosed. And the problem is the diagnosis and who is doing the diagnosis. Now, unfortunately, there are educators, and I've worked with them at times, who glibly, if they have a child who they're having some problems with, first thing they say to their parent is Maria or Johnny or Juan or Kendrick or whoever has ADHD, go see your doctor, go get meds. What a turnoff. It's inappropriate, but there are teachers who at times will say that. There are other times where a parent will talk to a pediatrician and describe some things, and before you know it, the pediatrician either says, well, your kid's fine here. I don't see any acting out or impulsivity, so no ADHD, even though your teachers or you see things at home and your pediatrician dismisses it, or your pediatrician just listens to you and says, oh, your child sounds like ADHD. Let me prescribe some stimulant medication and see what happens. Obviously, either approach is wrong. One of the reasons that an ADHD child might be calm when they're with a pediatrician in a doctor's office is novelty. The what we call the white coat effect, calms a child down because it's a novel situation, it's an unknown. We all know that novelty creates attention for kids with ADHD. So the doctor not seeing something immediately could be the white coat effect, the novelty or just being in a doctor's office that creates the focus and the ADHD does not appear. Secondarily, the doctor might be too quick to just listen to what you're saying to make that diagnosis. And the problem is there is no real medical criteria that exists for diagnosing ADHD. They're on the verge, maybe at some future date, there will be, through an MRI imaging of the brain, we're learning more and more about the biology of ADHD, that there will be down the road some sort of clinical criteria for ADHD. That would be extremely helpful, but right now there is not. It's strictly behavioral. And the criteria that should be used comes from the Bible for psychologists and psychiatrists, which is called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, issue number 5, which is the criteria for all mental illnesses, so that doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, when they bill an insurance company, can fill out a diagnostic code when they're asked to fill out a diagnosis, they have to codify it and put a number, and it has to match the criteria of DSM to be a fully qualified psychiatric diagnosis. Now, I'm going to go over this DSM with you, but I want to remind you that it's available to you on Google. Just Google DSM criteria for ADHD, and you could read it for yourselves. So after I go over it, believe me, don't feel you have to memorize it. You can look it up. But what it does do is remind us of exactly what are the proper diagnostic criteria for ADHD before we put on that label. And I got to remind folks, one other common misconception is somehow that there's a separate category called ADD, separate from ADHD. No, there isn't. There is only one diagnostic criteria, is ADHD. Now, that doesn't mean, even though that stands for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, it doesn't mean to be ADHD, you have to be hyperactive. And we're going to get into that at the two variations. There are actually three variations of ADHD. Inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. And we've noticed over the years that the inattentive only seems to show up a little bit more often with girls, and often does not get quickly diagnosed because in school, inattentiveness doesn't bring about as much attention from teachers as hyperactivity. Hyperactivity gets attention of teachers very quickly, so they're very quick to point it out and look at ADHD. But if your child is a daydreamer, has trouble focusing, organizing, teachers tend to try to be helpful, but they're not so quick to send an email or call the parent and demonstrate that this is a real problem. So girls tend to be even more underdiagnosed who are purely inattentive type. Boys tend to be more overdiagnosed because they tend to be more the hyper type. And frankly, the most common is really combined, where you see some inattentiveness combined with some hyperactivity, and you have the combined ADHD. The other thing to keep in mind is that ADHD has a large genetic compound to it. Therefore, if you as parents don't have ADHD, again, I used to say, if you shake the family tree, you're going to find somebody who had symptoms who was ADHD, or not fully, but had characteristics of ADHD. There is a continuum of severity till you get to be full blown, but frankly, there is a strong genetic component, and usually either one or both parents, grandparents, and uncle, you can usually find in the family tree someone who demonstrated ADHD behaviors. So keep that in mind when you're looking at your child's behavior, to think about your behaviors, your relatives, etc., to see if there's someone on the family tree who has ADHD. So what does inattentive look like? So this is what's written in the DSM. 6 or more symptoms of inattention for children up to age 16, or 5 or more for adolescents age 17 and older, and adults. Symptoms of inattention have been present for at least 6 months, and they are inappropriate for development levels. So here are the keys. Up to age 16 and present for at least 6 months. So it's not a phase. Oh, they're forgetful. They're always losing stuff. Well, that might be ADHD inattentive. It might be a phase. It might be short term, and they grow out of it, and you come up with some strategies. So before we jump to labels, We need to see these things happening sustained for a period of time over 6 months. And often when we go to get advice or a pediatrician or a school person, they're talking immediate and not looking at the 6 month picture. Your job as a parent to remember that. So what are the criteria? Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork or work in other activities. Again, people do this as part, we all do that. We often make mistakes. But if it's persistent over 6 months and interferes with what's appropriate developmentally, then it's something that we have to pay attention to. Often has trouble holding attention on tasks or play activities. Again, a pattern over 6 months of inattention, either on task or even in play, daydreaming, just not focusing. Ferdinand the Bull who's out there in a pasture smelling the flowers instead of participating in bull games. I remember my daughter who started soccer at age 6. She would stand there in the outfield looking up at the sun and the clouds. Obviously, this was not for her. The inattention in that soccer field, that wasn't her thing. But she wasn't ADHD. It was situational. Soccer wasn't her thing. When she went to dance class, she paid careful attention. So we were able to distinguish between a specific inattention or broad-based inattention that was overall affecting schoolwork or her developmental stages. Often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Again, all children don't always listen all the time. We need a prolonged pattern, 6 months of at least 6 months of not listening, of being a common, persistent problem to begin to think this is ADHD inattentive. Often has trouble organizing tasks and activities. And we call this executive function. Again, kids tend to be sloppy, they throw their clothes on the floor, but if they can't come up with a plan with you to organize their stuff, to figure out a way to say which comes first, which comes second, and there are ways to coping with that. We tell teachers often, do not give multiple instructions, don't bundle, do one task at a time. And that helps with folks with inattentive executive function, which goes along with ADHD. Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to do tasks that require mental effort over a long period of time. Anything that sustains attention becomes a problem. Again, it has to be over 6 months and fairly persistent. Happens occasionally, is very normal. Don't jump to the conclusion that your child is ADHD. Often loses things necessary for tasks and activities. School materials, pencils, wallets, keys, paperwork, eyeglasses, mobile phones. Those are the kinds of things. Yes, I remember when I was in junior high, I kept losing my bus pass. This happened over a period of few months. Was I ADHD inattentive? No. I just was going through that distracted early adolescent phase of not paying attention. So with focus and structure, I was able to overcome it. We didn't need to jump to the conclusion that I was ADHD inattentive because again, 6 months is the key. And lastly, is often distracted or forgetful of daily activities. Again, the key word is how often and sustained over 6 months. Now let's talk about hyperactivity and impulsivity. Again, 6 or more symptoms over a period of 6 months up to age 16, and those are the keys. So what are we looking at? Often fidgets, toe taps, constantly squirms. Again, we need to see a prolonged pattern over 6 months. Often, teachers might mention, often lose their seat in situations when remaining seating is expected. So if a teacher said, Juan is always getting up, never sits still, have a trouble with Miranda, she's always jumping up out of her seat, always wandering, even though I have to constantly remind her. Well, if this is happening pretty much over the school year, and a child is apologetic and just says, I got to get up, I'm a very movie person, whatever, pay attention. That could be signs of the hyperactivity, impulsivity over a period of time. Other things, often unable to play or take part in a leisure activity that requires teamwork or communicating. So we find that kids with ADHD don't do as well in team sports. These are kids who interrupt their coaches, they interrupt their fellow players, they might shout corrections, just inappropriate impulsivity. And these are kids who do better at individual sports. I'm always reminded of Michael Phelps, the great swimming champion. And he was classically ADHD, impulsive type, and his mom, who was a teacher, recognized that early and got him into swimming. And as an individual sport, even though he still had his ADHD, which needed to be managed, he thrived in his individual sport. So individual sports are more fitting for an ADHD than team sports. So don't force fit when you have recognized that. So if they can't take part in leisure activities quietly, they often seem to be on the go or driven by a motor, or talks excessively, blurts out an answer before a question has been completed, has trouble waiting their turn, often interrupts or intrudes on others. This is really a problem because this could lead to social issues. If your children are always interrupting conversation and peers, blurting out something they shouldn't, peers tend to turn them off. They become socially isolated. Kids with ADHD tend to become more and more socially isolated. They begin to lose their social skills because of the ADHD. So I suggest that if you have concern, if you want to learn more, make sure you take a look at the DSM criteria. Remind your healthcare professional and your teachers what's in the criteria. Ask the questions. Have you seen these activities for a period of over 6 months? Are they sustainable for a period of 6 months? So make sure that the diagnosis is accurate before you start on a path of proper treatment. And as I discussed in my last video, there are treatments. They are both manageable behavioral interventions. I always mention the 3 keys: structure, novelty, and brevity. What do I mean? Structure, the more structure in a child's life, the better they can manage their ADHD. They need our activities laid out, understood, calendars, tasks, charts, checking off when things get done, those kinds of structural issues. It's so important. Rehearsing, reminding people of the rules for a particular activity before they start. Those all help in structure. When I say novelty, kids on ADHD respond quickly to novelty. That's why they do such a good job. Kids who can't pay attention in school for a minute can watch and do a video game for an hour. There's a novelty about the flashing screen that keeps their attention going. And the last one is brevity. And I mentioned that before. when you give instructions, when you lay out something, make it simple, make it brief. Do not bundle multiple instructions together. And lastly, if medication is recommended, don't just automatically turn your nose to it. It turns out that most of the ADHD medications have limited side effects, have been studied for years, and in general, coupled with some behavioral interventions, over 65% of the time between proper medication and behavioral interventions, ADHD begins to be under control. So there is hope. There are means. Be a good consumer, do your homework, and especially don't frown on the medications that are recommended, the Ritalin, the Adderalls, their derivatives, and there are a number of things on the market to discuss with your prescribing doc. But don't frown your nose. It might be worth giving a chance. I've seen tremendous success over the years for kids who are properly medicated and the parents are doing the behavioral interventions at home. So now I'll sign off. Remind folks to check out our book, Family Centered Parenting, Your Guide to Growing Great Families. It can be found on Amazon or more information on our website, familycenteredparenting.com. So I look forward to talking to you again and answering your questions. And this is Dr. H signing off.